everyone, it's Jananie and welcome back to my channel, This Story Ain't Over. Today we are filming my most exciting video of the year every year, which is my top 10 favorite books of the year. I can't believe 2021 is already over, and I say that every year at the end of every year, but I honestly can't believe it. But I'm really excited for 2022 because I feel like there's a lot of things in 2021 that I'd like to leave behind. But as with every one of these videos, I'm going to be telling you in order my top 10 favorite books that I read during the year of 2021. So these are not books that came out during 2021, but these are books that I read in 2021 that are my favorites. This list is completely subjective. I don't really care about whether the book is like objectively good in the eyes of many others. This is my personal top 10 favorites list for the year. Something I'm doing a little bit different for this video is that I'm going to be mentioning 3 honorable mentions because I honestly could not whittle this list down to 10, but I feel like there was 3 extra books that I read this year that I really wanted to mention and that I want a lot more people to read because they were fantastic and they hit me in specific ways. So I just want to talk about them in this video that usually gets a bajillion views. So yeah, let's get into it. I'm going to tell you my 3 honorable mentions and then we'll get into the top 10 list starting from 10 up to 1. So I should preface the honorable mentions by saying that these 3 aren't really ranked. They are just a few that I wanted to mention in addition to the top 10 because I just really love them. So the first is The Beautiful Ones by Silvia Moreno Garcia. I think it's no surprise to anyone who's been watching my channel for a while that Silvia Moreno Garcia is in this video. I've been raving about her book since I think September of this year when I read this book and absolutely fell in love with it and then proceeded to devour the rest of her catalog. And honestly, this one has a special place in my heart because it gives me like Pride and Prejudice vibes with a dash of magic and just some like crazy plot twists. And I absolutely loved it. I think it was a fantastic read and just a really enjoyable romance. If you're looking for a book with some really vivid characters and a really interesting sort of change in character, this is a really fun one to read. I absolutely love the way that Silvia Moreno Garcia paints her characters, and I think this one was just like a really great fave that just like didn't make it quite to my like top 10, but it was just one that I really loved regardless. Alrighty, the next one is one that honestly took me by surprise because I didn't expect to love it, and when I read it I was just so captivated by the characters that I just could not put it down, and that book is The Atlas 6 by Olivia Blake. So many of you may know this is a self-published book by Olivia Blake. She's also a fan fiction writer, and this book follows this mysterious Alexandrian society where these 6 different magic users are inducted into the society, told that they're going to go through an initiation year, and at the end of the year only 5 of them will remain as part of the society and continue to have access to all this knowledge, and 1 of them will be eliminated. And so we follow these 6 different characters, and honestly I heard about this book through Book Talk on TikTok, and that is honestly the reason why I decided to pick this up, because I read it for a video that I did where I was testing Book Talk recommendation. If you want to watch that video, I'll leave it linked down below. But I had the best experience with this book and I was just like so captivated by the characters, and by the end of it I just couldn't stop thinking about each of them and like what would happen in the future books, and I just honestly want to know more. This book is getting traditionally published by Tor Books in March of 2022, so I'm really excited for when that comes out because I believe it'll be a little bit more edited, and a sequel will also be coming out I think later in 2020 or 2023, which is really exciting. So I overall really love this. I think it could have used a little bit more polishing, but I just love the characters so much that I could not go without mentioning it. Alrighty, the next book is a book that I read in December, and this is like a very personal favorite of mine now, and that is Marriage of a Thousand Lies by S.J. Sindhu. And the reason I wanted to mention this book is because it is unlike anything I've ever read, and it also represented a part of my identity that I've never actually seen. It basically follows this Sri Lankan American Tamil girl who is I think in her late 20s, and she's in the fake marriage with her like gay best friend. She's a lesbian, and knowing her conservative parents and the conservative background that she comes from in the community, she decides to enter this fake marriage with her best friend in order to just like continue her relationship with her family and not get cut off from them. And then there's also like these other stories with her older sisters as well, and their sort of complicated personal things going on. But when the book actually opens up, we're actually following the main character returning home after a long time, and her best friend Nisha from childhood is going to be getting married, and it's like this arranged marriage, and what we find out is that the main character and Nisha were lovers when they were younger. And so the main character is sort of dealing with the heartbreak of seeing her childhood love get married off and get into this marriage that she knows is going to be fake, but not fake in the way that like her own marriage is. So overall, it was just a really interesting concept, and I think it was really, really well done, and like it had some really powerful moments to it. It wasn't like my favorite in terms of like plot wise. I feel like it did get a little bit repetitive, but regardless, I loved it so much, and I think it has like a special place in my heart now. So I highly recommend it to anyone who like comes from a similar background or wanted to see the specific representation. It was fantastic and highly recommend. Alrighty, so those are the 3 honorable mentions that I wanted to talk about in this video. Now we're gonna get into my top 10 books of 2021. As I said, I'm gonna be going in order from 10 up to 1, and I'm kind of cheating on number 10 because I have technically 2 books by the same author that I just couldn't decide between, but that I read both in 2021. And so those 2 books are both by Emily Henry, who is a fantastic romance writer that I discovered this year. I read Beach Read, I think in February of this year, and then I read People We Meet on Vacation, I think sometime in the summer, I think August or something, and I absolutely loved both of these, and I honestly couldn't decide between both of them for this video because they were both just fantastic. Beach Read follows 2 different writers who find themselves living in neighboring beach houses during the summer, and it follows our main character January, who is dealing with the death of her father and is actually returning to this beach house to wrap up his affairs and sort of sell the house because she found out that this was actually his second home with the woman that he was having an affair with. And so she has like all these complicated feelings, but she also has a writing deadline. She has to finish her newest romance novel by the end of the summer, but she's sort of not really feeling the romance vibe and not really believing in love anymore. She's also gotten out of a really long relationship, and she finds herself living right next door to her university sort of nemesis, who is Augustus, who happens to be a like mystery fiction writer, and he's more highbrow, and he's, you know, hit the New York Times more times than her, and he's a lot more successful than her, and so she has like sort of this complex about him. And so it starts as a bit of an enemies to lovers, but really it turns into a friends to lovers situation, and was honestly just so cute. I also felt like the grief elements dealing with like January's father was also really well done, so I felt like overall it was just a really great read. And then People We Meet on Vacation is also equally fantastic. It follows a like true friends to lovers situation. It follows Poppy and Alex, who met in university but are actually from the same hometown, and ever since meeting in university they've been going on these like yearly summer vacations, these like trips to different locations, and Poppy is the type of person who really likes to travel, is very extroverted, whereas Alex is very like introverted, wants to settle down in one place, and so their personalities are quite opposite, but they've been friends through the decade. But everything changed 2 summers ago when something went wrong on one of their trips and they stopped talking. And so the book actually follows 2 different timelines. The first is where Poppy is trying to mend their relationship and gets back into contact with Alex, asks him to go on another vacation with her so that she can mend their relationship. And then the other chapters follow their different vacations over the 10 years and what sort of happened during those vacations. And so you're seeing like different parts of their relationship as you're going along and seeing how it fell apart, and just the angsty vibes were just so well done, and I think she just wrote a really perfect friends to lovers romance. So between these I couldn't really decide, but I felt like it sort of fit to just have her as like number 10 with both of her books. Alrighty, we are on to number 9. So I feel like 2021 was a really great year for me in terms of reading historical fictions. I read a lot more than I usually do, and I enjoyed a lot more of them than I usually do, which was really great. So number 8 is, as you probably guessed, a historical fiction, and that is The Stationery Shop by Marjan Kamali. This book was just so freaking fantastic and like the perfect book to just make you cry tears of like heartbreak if you are looking for that. I often look for books to destroy me, so that is just a vibe. This book sort of follows 2 different timelines, but really mostly one. It opens up with this woman who is visiting this man that she used to know very long ago, and she is seeing him after many years. And you find out that she used to know this man in 1950s Tehran when they both lived in Iran, and they fell in love. But because of unfortunate circumstances, they were ripped apart, but we don't know why. And so she's meeting him after decades. And so the book then flips back to 1950s Tehran, and you are hearing the story from the main character, and you are seeing how they sort of get ripped apart, but also all the things that happened afterwards too, to sort of evolve both their characters. And I think it was just such an interesting romance, but also like historical fiction, and a really interesting look into the main character's journey as a woman and a mother. And overall, it just like broke my heart. And I think it was just a really emotional read that will just have you like flipping pages to the end. I just wanted to know what was going to happen with these characters, and I felt so much for them and their stories, and it just felt like so heartbreaking, I think, and that was like the overall feeling I had. This also deals with some of the political things going on in Iran during that time, and also has some really interesting like side characters as well, and people involved with the main couple's story, which I think was just so interesting because you're sort of trying to figure out like who is involved in which aspects of the story, and it just was overall really well done. So if you're looking for historical fiction, if you're looking for romance, if you're looking for something heartbreaking, this is definitely the one to pick up. So now we are on to number 8, which is another historical fiction, and that is Next Year in Havana by Chanel Cleeton. So as you guys may know, if you've been following my channel, this is the book that we read for the first ever month of the Read in Color book club, which is the book club that I host here on my channel. Every month we read a book by a BIPOC author and we discuss it together in a live show at the beginning of the next month. And I also partner up with a book influencer of some kind who shares the same background as the author of the book so that we can discuss as well during the live show. And so for November of 2021, we read Next Year in Havana, and honestly this book was just so heartbreaking as well and so well done that I just couldn't not include it on this list because it just blew me away. I took my time reading this one over the course of November because I wanted to be able to remember everything that happens when I had to talk about it in the live show at the beginning of December. But if I had let myself, I know I would have devoured this in like a couple days. Basically, this book follows 2 different timelines. It follows our main character Marisol, who's living in our current day in Miami, and she's grown up on these stories that her grandmother Elisa used to tell her about her home, Cuba. And so when Marisol's grandmother dies, she actually leaves her with the task of spreading her ashes in Cuba for her. And so Marisol travels to Cuba in 2017 to go spread her grandmother's ashes and also see the place that she's only heard about in stories. But when she gets there, she finds that the Cuba of her grandmother's stories is a little bit different than it is in current day. And then the other timeline that we're getting is in Havana in 1958 in Cuba, where we are following Marisol's grandmother Elisa, and she is this wealthy woman in Havana, and she has privilege that many of the other people in Cuba do not. And we are finding out that she fell in love with a political revolutionary during this very like politically fraught time in Cuba, and there was this whole other side to her story that Marisol never knew about. And then we are seeing sort of the 2 different timelines connect as Marisol starts to learn parts of her grandmother's story that she had never told her before. Overall, it's just a really sweeping book with romances in both timelines and some really interesting conversations about the politics going on in Cuba, both in 1950s and in our current day. And I remember we just had such a great discussion when we were talking about this for the Read in Color book club, and just like that discussion just put such a smile on my face because there's so many of you who learned so much about Cuba, but also so many of you who felt seen in this book, which just made me so happy. And I think overall it was just such a well done book, really well written, and I loved the balance that the author had between both the rosy romance and the sort of harsh political realities. So if you're looking for a historical fiction, if you're looking for a romance, if you're looking for something with lots of plot twists that will leave your jaw hanging, this is definitely the one to pick up, and it was also equally heartbreaking as The Stationery Shop. Alrighty, we are now on to number 7, and you all are gonna honestly think that I only like sad books because this next one is really sad, and that is An Emotion of Great Delight by Tara Mafi. It's probably no surprise to many of you who have seen my previous videos and know how much I love Tara Mafi's other contemporary, A Very Large Expanse of Sea, but I was super excited when I found out that Tara Mafi was writing another contemporary, YA contemporary, and I was honestly a little bit hesitant though when I actually got this in the mail and like went to read it because I had heard sort of mixed feelings about it. But as soon as I picked this up and started reading it, I was just sucked in, and I remember I read it in like a single day, and I was listening to the audiobook as well and just like following along, and it was honestly one of the most powerful books I've ever read, very similar to A Very Large Expanse of Sea, but also quite different as well. This is like a super short book, and it basically follows our main character Shadi, who is sort of reeling from the death of her brother and some complicated things going on with her family, and also a really complicated sort of friend breakup going on with one of her best friends from childhood over what seems to be a very will they won't they romance with her best friend's brother. father. And so she has all these sort of complicated relationships going on and a really deep-seated grief over her brother. And she's just dealing with all these very massive emotions and not really knowing what to do with them. And so we're seeing her make her way through these emotions and these difficult relationships. And I think the overall vibe of this book was very sad. Like, Shadi's a very sad character. She has had some really horrible things happen to her, and I think I just really related to her as a character just being sad, if that makes sense. It's a very weird book to explain, but I think there's just some really relatable and powerful things in this book that I've never seen sort of represented, and I just loved that aspect of it. So if you were looking for a sad book, or if you were ever a teen who used to blast like really loud rock music and, you know, be a sad teen, this is definitely the book to read, because I was that teen and I loved this book. Okay, next up we have number 6, and this is the book that probably took me the most by surprise out of everything on this list, because I went into this book not expecting to actually like it all that much, but it ended up being one of my favorite books of this year, as you can tell. And that book is The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. So this book, as you can probably tell, is a horror book, and if you guys have been following my channel for a while, you probably know that I don't actually read a lot of horror. I have read maybe like a handful of horror books over the course of my life and like my reading journey. And so this one was really a step out of my comfort zone, and I'm so glad I did it. I picked this one up because of Kayla from Books and Lala. It's one of her favorite books, and I went into it not really knowing much, but the foreword at the beginning of the book has a little bit of a letter from the author, and he sort of talks about his inspiration for this book and how he wanted this book to be sort of a face-off between his mom and Dracula, and the idea of like people not really valuing domestic work and, you know, stay-at-home moms, especially when he was a kid in the 1990s or 80s, and pitting that woman against sort of this person with no ties, this person who just leeches on other people, a vampire, or sort of the idea of a serial killer. And so Dracula versus his mom, which was just the coolest concept. And the minute I sort of read that, I was like, this seems really interesting. I really want to read this. And so I sort of dove into it. And basically it is set in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And you were following this suburban mom named Patricia Campbell. And she has like her network of stay-at-home moms who have this like little book club where they read true crime novels. And they're sort of not taken seriously by their husbands in most of the town, but they're just known as these like dependable stay-at-home moms. But the book takes off when this stranger comes to town named James Harris, and everyone's sort of taken by him. He's so charming, and, you know, all the husbands love him, and even the stay-at-home moms really think he's awesome. But when a bunch of kids start going missing in the neighboring town, Patricia Campbell starts to get a little suspicious, and she starts to realize that James might have something to do with it. And obviously he's a vampire in the story, and so the book becomes her trying to prove that he's a vampire and convince these people who are determined to give him the benefit of the doubt because he is a straight white male in the 1990s, convince them that he is, you know, a danger to everyone around them. And there's some really great discussions of like race and privilege in this book as well that I really appreciated, and just the overall concept of centering the stay-at-home mom into the narrative was just so fantastic, and I just loved the way that the author wrote it. So overall, if you're looking for a really great horror book, if you're looking for old school vampires, if you're looking for just something that will really get you thinking, this is definitely the book to pick up. And it's also got some really scary bits to it. I forgot to mention that. It was absolutely terrifying and horrifying at some points, and I honestly really enjoyed it. So I have now realized that horror is one of my new favorite genres. So that was exciting. Alrighty, we are now on to the top 5 of this list, which is pretty exciting. And this next one is also excitingly a horror as well, and that is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. So as I said at the beginning of this video, it's no surprise that Silvia Moreno Garcia is in this video. I absolutely love The Beautiful Ones, but I do think Mexican Gothic ended up being my favorite of her books, of the ones that I have read. And the reason is because this one just captivated me in a way that I didn't expect, and I think the horror elements were done really well as well. Basically, this book follows our main character Noemi, who is sort of like this wealthy socialite, and the book is set in 1950s Mexico, and Noemi receives a letter from her cousin who has recently gotten married to this like English lord or something who has this fancy country house in the Mexican countryside, and she gets this letter from her cousin who is basically saying that her husband is crazy and that he is poisoning her and that there are people walking through walls in the house and that, you know, all these strange things are going on. And so Noemi isn't really sure if her cousin is going crazy or if these things are actually happening and if her husband is actually doing something horrible to her. And so at the direction of her father, she goes to the countryside to High Place where her cousin is staying and is determined to find out what's going on. And from there, this sort of turns into a haunted house story, which I absolutely loved so freaking much. And just the way that it was done and sort of the explanations for why all of the like creepy and crazy things were going on was just super cool in my opinion. I know some people were disappointed by it, but I absolutely loved it, and I think it was just like such an interesting way of imagining this idea. And I also just loved like the dynamic between Noemi and the other characters in the book as well, and sort of the tension between them. There was a little bit of a romance in this, which was nice, but wasn't like my favorite part of the book. I think it was a nice addition, but I think the overall sort of haunted house aspect and Noemi as a character was what really drew me into the story, and I just couldn't put this book down. I think I read it in a few days because I just kept flipping pages because I wanted to know how it was going to end and like what the mystery was, and it was just so interesting. So overall, if you're looking for a really cool gothic horror, something a little bit sexy, romantic, but also really freaking creepy, this is definitely the book to pick up. Alrighty, number 4 is one that is probably not a surprise for many people here on BookTube, but also not a surprise for anyone who watches Book Talk, because this one is a really popular one on there, and that book is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. So this is a book that I had been meaning to read for ages and never got around to. I had Circe by this author on my TBR for ages because I actually own that book, and I never got around to reading it, but I had seen this sort of blowing up on TikTok and I was like, you know what, let me give it a try. So I bought the book and started reading it, and honestly, like, I can't believe I didn't read this sooner. I knew what it was about. Basically, it follows Achilles from Greek mythology, from the Iliad, the epic, and sort of follows that entire timeline. And so I knew this from the beginning. I knew that that was the concept of the story, but what I didn't know is that the book is actually written from the perspective of Achilles' best friend, Patroclus. And I think that aspect is what made me super excited to read this when I found that out when I started reading it, because Patroclus is such a iconic character from Greek mythology if you know the mythology, and if you actually know the story of the Iliad. I think just knowing that it's written from Patroclus's perspective is just a really interesting thing. So I know the entire story from mythology and I know how the epic ends, so I knew how this book was gonna end, but honestly, like, that just made me even more sad as I was reading this book and, you know, getting sucked into their story. Basically, we are seeing Achilles and Patroclus as their young children, and as they meet and grow up together and train together and become friends and then eventually lovers, and then enter into the Trojan War and all the war aspects going on. I think it did have a bit of a slow start, but I think once it got into it and once it got into the war aspects, it was just so fantastic. And I was just remembering all these things that I had learned from mythology and from school. I was in classics for most of high school, so I was just remembering all these things, and it was just like so nice to just see like dramatized, I think. And so by the end of it, I was just absolutely destroyed and was in tears. I have a whole vlog of me reading this if you want to go check it out. I love the way that the author sort of imagined their story and extrapolated from the original epic. I think it was just so fantastically done. So if you're looking for something inspired by Greek mythology, if you're looking for a heartbreaking story, if you're looking for something a little bit gay, if you're looking for just like something that will leave you in tears by the end, this is definitely the one to pick up. Alrighty, we are on to the top 3, and this is where it gets exciting. So this next one is probably not a surprise to anyone who's been following my channel for a while. This is the final book in a trilogy that I absolutely love by an author that is probably one of my favorites ever. And that book is The Bronze Beast by Roshni Chokshi, which is the final book in the Gilded Wolves trilogy. So if you guys have been following my channel for any amount of time, The Gilded Wolves is one of my favorite series of all time. I absolutely love the characters, I love the story, I love the themes that it explores, and I also really love Roshni Chokshi's other books as well. And so I knew this book was going to destroy me from the beginning. I had heard people who had read early copies that it was just an incredible ending, and so when it came out, I sort of binge read it. And I did a whole spoilery vlog for my patrons as well. If you're interested, you can sign up for my Patreon in the description down below. Absolutely devoured it, and by the end of it, I was just like left in tears. Like, I was sobbing by the end of this book because it was wrapped up in such a great way and also had such a heartbreaking ending, like a bittersweet ending, that I really, really loved. I think I absolutely love fantasy series that sort of tie off with bittersweet endings, because I think it really sort of ties in the stakes of what they've been doing over the course of the series, and I just love that. So this was an incredible conclusion to the series. For those of you who don't know The Gilded Wolves, it's basically a fantasy series set in our real world, but in the past, in the 1800s, and it follows a very diverse cast of characters from different walks of life and, you know, different parts of the world, and they're all sort of coming together. And in this version of our world, there is this type of magic called forging, where you can imbue objects with like magical power, and this sort of ties into the overall theme of the series, which is like colonialism and the effects it has on the characters and their lives, and how they're sort of trying to reclaim their own narratives and parts of their lives. And so overall, it's just super cool and and fantastically done. And I just loved this ending, which is why it's like on my top 10 for this year, and also like one of my favorite series endings ever. Like it's up there with Champion, like the end of the Legend series, because it was just so amazing and fantastic, and I just loved it. I love heartbreak at the end of a series, so yeah. If you haven't finished the Gilded Wolves series yet, definitely go finish it, and if you haven't read the series yet, I highly recommend it. It's one of my favorites ever. Okay, for my second top favorite book of the year, we have one that I've been talking about for basically all this year because it's actually a book that I read at the very beginning of this year, and that is Yoke by Mary H.K. Choi. So this is a YA contemporary that follows a pair of sisters in New York City. And as I said, I've been talking about this since the beginning of the year because I read it at the beginning of the year and absolutely fell in love with it. It was such a well-written story and really grabbed me by the heartstrings. It was also super relatable. I really love the main character, Jane's voice. She has like that really sarcastic, self-deprecating humor that is like really relatable, I feel like. And basically the book follows our main character Jane and also her older sister June, and these two have had a really complicated relationship sort of growing up and as they moved into adulthood. But when June is diagnosed with cancer, the two of them are forced to interact with each other in ways that they haven't had to before, and Jane has to be there for her in ways that she hasn't had to before. And so this situation sort of complicates their relationship, but also simplifies it in a way because they're forced to prioritize their relationship and really try to mend it. And it's just a really well-written story, really relatable if you have siblings at all, and just overall really powerful as well. I think both characters were just so complex, and just seeing them unravel their own personal baggage was just so interesting to watch. And I just love Jane as a character. Like, I honestly can't explain this book very well because it's just one of those books that you just need to go into and read and experience, and you will see what I mean. But overall, really fantastically done. The book also has a bit of a romance, which was like a nice aspect to it, but like wasn't my favorite part. I think the overall focus and best parts of the book were like the sibling relationship and also just seeing Jane's relationship with her family sort of evolve as well. I will say that this book does represent a bit of Jane's eating disorder, so I would be mindful of that if you're going into it, just like as a content warning. But yeah, overall, just a really fantastic book and a really well done YA contemporary. Like, I wish I had this book when I was a teen. Alrighty, the final book on this list, my #1 favorite book of 2021, is probably a big surprise for many of you because it's actually not a novel, it is a memoir. And that book is You Can't Be Serious by Kal Penn. And I'm honestly as surprised as many of you probably are because I went into this knowing that I would probably like it, but I didn't think I would love it. But basically this is a memoir written by Kal Penn, who is an actor, and he also worked for the Obama administration, and he has had a pretty interesting career overall, and this book sort of outlines his journey of like going to school and like getting into acting and then getting into politics and then going back to acting afterwards, and overall just his story, but told in a really humorous and funny way and very relatable way as well. I actually read this entirely through the audiobook, so it's actually narrated by Kal Penn himself, so you're hearing him like tell all of his jokes and also tell his story in a very authentic and relatable way. And I think overall what I loved about this book and what made it my favorite of the year is that I just related so hard to it. Kal Penn talks about like his struggles with like getting into acting and like dealing with the comments from like family who didn't think it was a viable career to go into, but he also talks about like his struggles with getting into Hollywood and like the challenges he faced as a person of color and like often the very like harrowing situations that he was in. But he also told all of this in a very like funny and humorous way, and I found myself just really enjoying the entire journey of reading this. Like, this was probably the most enjoyable book I read this entire year, which is saying something. And I read it in like I think a day or two while listening to the audiobook, and it was just such a great time, and I like hadn't had that much fun reading a book in a really long time. Like, I think there's a difference between like reading a novel and like really wanting to know what happens versus hearing a story and like really enjoying it and just enjoying the act of listening. I think I'm not really explaining myself properly, but I just love this so much, and it has like a very special place in my heart. And yeah, I just love that he decided to share this, and it was just fantastic. So if you're looking for a memoir to read, one that's like really fun, really relatable if you're a person of color in a career field that is not really what anyone wanted you to do or thought was right for you, this is definitely the one to pick up. And with that said, those are my top 10 favorite books of 2021. This is honestly a whirlwind year for me. I feel like there's so many things going on this year, both in like my personal life and also with work and also with this channel. We hit 50,000 subscribers this year. There's so many of you who have sort of joined along in the journey and have been watching my videos and, you know, commenting and just showing your appreciation and love. I think at the end of every year, I always want to take the moment to say thank you so much for all of your support, for just being here with me, for listening to me talk about my favorite books and ramble and rave constantly. I'm so thankful for all of you, and you know, appreciate that you get like your book recommendations from me. I think that's just really, really cool and just makes me very happy and puts a smile on my face. So I hope you all will be here in 2022, and I'm excited for all of the videos to come and all the conversations that we're going to have. I would love to hear from all of you what books were your favorite from 2021. Leave me your top 10 list down below. And I would also love to hear if any of the books on my list were your favorites of the year as well, or what you thought of these books in general, because I just love to discuss. If you haven't already, go check out my Instagram, Twitter, Goodreads, and TikTok in the description down below. And as always, I will see you in my next video, and please remember that this story ain't over. Bye!